Mr. Porter, your opening statement when you're ready, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Danny Porter. I'm the District Attorney for Gwinnett County, and along with my Chief Assistant, Lisa Jones, we're going to be representing the state of Georgia in this case, because all crimes and all indictments are styled state versus the defendant, and we are here on behalf of the people of Georgia. For over 30 years, I've said exactly those same words as I begin every opening statement in every case I've ever tried. I was told once that if you have that ritual, it helps calm you down and lets you talk rationally and lets you speak to the jury calmly. But in this case, I'm not sure it works, because this is a case of a Cinderella story gone horribly wrong. In this case, there won't be any glass slipper. There won't be any handsome prince. The defendant doesn't have to be home by midnight. And there won't be any happy ending. Because this is a case where you only have the evil stepmother. And as a result of that, an 11-year-old child was starved to death at her hand, while her own children remained healthy and happy. Now, the judge has read you the indictment, and I'm not going to bother to read it again to you, except to remind you that this really, the indictment are the formalized charges, and they form the framework by which you'll make the decision, which I honestly understand may be among the most difficult decisions you've ever made in your life. Nobody ever told you it was going to be easy. We tried to warn you about that it might be difficult. But justice is sometimes difficult. And the right thing to do is sometimes hard. But in order to perform your task as a juror, the first thing you always go to is the indictment, because it is the plan, it is the framework upon which all the facts must hang. The state always has the burden to prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's a burden that we accept and welcome, because it would not be right to convict someone of a crime, particularly a crime this serious, if the state could not prove its case. And I'm confident that we can. But in each crime, there are what are called elements. Elements are the essential facts in each crime that the state must prove. Some of them are easy. For instance, that we have to prove that the defendant actually committed the crime. And we have to prove that that case occurred in Gwinnett County. Some of them are going to require you analyze and put together the evidence in the case and reach conclusions or inferences. And those are the elements, for instance, in murder, where we have to prove that this defendant, with malice aforethought, which is a term that'll be defined for you, intentionally caused the death of Emani Moss. We have to prove in count 2 that this defendant caused the death of Emani Moss, whether intentionally or not, during the commission of another felony. In other words, if you commit a felony and someone dies as a result of that, you're responsible for murder, whether you intended to kill them or not. And that's during the commission of the crime of cruelty to a child. Cruelty to a child, which means causing that child cruel and unusual physical or mental pain, and in this case, by depriving her of the sustenance, the food and drink necessary to maintain human life. Now, I've made promises here. I've said we're going to prove this. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to prove it with evidence. Evidence is the testimony of witnesses and the exhibits that are introduced and admitted into court that you'll have with you, or at least the exhibits, and you'll have your memory of the testimony as you go back to deliberate. You can be aided by your notes, but they don't replace your individual and collective memory of what happened in this case. So I urge you, pay attention. But you need to pay attention for another reason. This is a terrible case. The facts of this case are difficult. There are going to be photographs, and there's going to be testimony that it's hard not to look away. But you just took an oath to reach a verdict that speaks the truth. And in order to reach the truth of this case, you can't flinch. You can't turn away from the truth. You have to face it, as difficult as it is, and you have to make your decision based on that truth. So what is the evidence? What is the truth of this case? Well, the truth is that on November the 2nd of 2013 at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, the Gwinnett County Police received a call. At first, they thought that it was a suicide call. There was a male threatening to commit suicide, but he also said he was there with the body of his dead daughter. When the police arrived, they discovered Eman Moss, the husband of this defendant. You'll hear from Eman Moss. You'll hear that he's already taken responsibility for his part in this case and that he's currently serving a life sentence in prison. But what they learned immediately from Eman Moss was that there was a trash can across the parking lot sitting in the grass of the apartment complex that they lived in. And when the officers went to the trash can, and they opened the trash can, the words of the officer were, "I saw the burned body of a little person." What was later discovered at autopsy is that it was the body of Emani Moss. She was 11 years old. She weighed 32 pounds. She had been wrapped in a comforter and then put in a trash bag and stuffed head down into a galvanized trash can and set on fire. And that's where this case began its investigation. But Emani's misery really started a long time ago, much longer, 3 years before that date in November. Because at that time, Eman was at work. There were 2 other children. There was Tristan and Emma. And in 2010, they were little. They were babies. So this defendant stayed at home and took care of the babies and watched Emani and was responsible for the discipline of Emani. And in 2010, in March, she beat the lights out of that child. She used a belt. She used the buckle end of the belt. And the next day, when Emani went to school, the teachers noticed that there were bruises all over her. And they reported it because they're required to. And it's the right thing to do. They reported it. And there was a police investigation. And this defendant was eventually charged with cruelty to a child in the first degree and pled guilty to that charge and was sentenced. And that changed the entire dynamic of this family. Because you'll learn that this defendant has a background in early childhood education. That for a while she worked as a teacher in a pre-K. But with that conviction, she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't have her job. She couldn't have what she was trained to do. And she was at home with 2 little babies and a 10-year-old girl that wasn't hers. Emani was only 6 at that time, so she was at home with a 6-year-old who wasn't hers. Over the next few months and few years, Emani tried to run away. In June of 2012, Gwinnett County Police responded to an apartment where Emani and Tristan and Emma and Eman and the defendant lived all together. And she had gone up to the apartment office manager and said, I want to run away from home. I don't want to go home. That the defendant tied me up with belts and put me in a cold shower. The police responded. They didn't observe any injuries on the child. They went back. The defendant said the child wasn't telling the truth. And what they did is they returned her to her stepmother and her father because there was no evidence to charge anybody at this time, even though the defendant at that time was on probation for child cruelty. A report was made to the Department of Family and Children's Services and was investigated by the Department of Family and Children's Services. But Emani remained in the custody of her father and her stepmother. In July, this defendant called the police in the evening of July the 26th and reported that Emani had run away again. The officers responded, and in the early morning hours of the 27th, they found her asleep in the bushes up by the gate of the apartment. And when they asked her why she was there, she said she didn't want to go home. That the defendant was mean to her, and she wanted to run away. But again, there was no evidence. There was no evidence of abuse. There was no evidence of injury, and Emani was returned to her father and her stepmother. The school year, on the other hand, was going pretty well. You'll hear from Emani's teachers that she was a healthy, happy child. She was little, but she was really friendly, and everybody liked her. She even tried to befriend the bully of the class because she felt sorry for the bully. And she was a little skinny thing, and we'll show you pictures. She's no giant, but she was healthy, and she's smiling. And we'll show you pictures from a field day where she was running and where she was enjoying the field day activities. And then on Mother's Day in 2000, and that, of course, year went into 2013. And on Mother's Day of 2013, she had a chance to meet with her family, particularly Eman's mother and his sister. And the first thing that Eman's mother noticed is that her long hair had been clipped down, like mine. And Emani's grandmother said, "What happened to your hair?" And this defendant said, "If you don't act pretty, you don't look pretty." And she admitted that she'd cut off all of Emani's hair. That was really the last time that any of Eman's family saw Emani. Because in the summer of 2013, they moved into an apartment here in the Lawrenceville area. It was 1100 Veranda Place. They rented an apartment there. They actually had one before, and then they moved into the apartment where the body was found. And for all intents and purposes, Emani vanished from the face of the earth. They filed a notice with the state that they were going to homeschool their children. You'll hear testimony from neighbors in the apartment complex that said they knew this couple had 2 children, but they never saw the third. Were never aware that that child would even existed. They saw instances where Eman and the defendant and Tristan and Emma would go out. They said, "We never saw the third child." And that's what began a period of isolation and that it's hard to even find a word to describe it. Because imagine what her life must have been like. There were 2 little ones. They weren't in school. By this time, Eman was working 2 jobs to try and keep afloat. He worked from early in the morning till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And then he would come home for a short period of time, and then he would leave to go to work again at 6 at night, 6 in the evening, and work till 10:30 or 11 at night. He had to drive an hour or 45 minutes to each job. So essentially he was sleeping and eating at his house, but was at work the rest of the time because that's how the bills had to be paid. So the defendant is there with a stepdaughter she hates, 2 children of her own. And in the fateful week of Halloween of 2013, right before the body was discovered, we're going to show you a series of events. Halloween was on a Thursday, but according to the statement of Eman, it really began on October the 24th. On the 24th, he came home from work and found Emani unresponsive in a bathtub. She couldn't speak. Her eyes rolled back and forth, but she couldn't communicate. And Eman picked her up and put her into bed, and she never left that bed. Because either on the 28th, or more likely the 30th, she died. The defendant was home when she died, and in fact may have called Eman at work and said, Emani's passed. But certainly, when Eman came home from his first job, on the 30th, he discovered Emani dead. The defendant was in the room when he discovered her dead and said, we have to hide the body. I can't go to jail. I don't want to lose my other children. So Eman went to work for his second job, and after that job he went to Walmart and he bought a trash can. You'll see that trash can. We'll bring it to you to look at, but it's a galvanized trash can. And we know at that point, from his own statement, that he took Emani out of her bed, a bed that we'll show was soiled with human waste, and they flipped the mattress, and the next day this defendant went to Anna's Linens and bought a new coverall and new sheets, and she put the new they flipped the mattress, stripped the bed, put the new cover on it, and the whole plan was, we're going to get rid of the body. We have to get rid of the body. Those are the words of the defendant, and we'll report her as a runaway. Halloween came, and Tristan and Emma were dressed up for trick-or-treat. We'll show you pictures of that. But keep in mind, during the time that those pictures were taken, and those 2 smiling children were in their costumes, Emani's laying dead because her body had been moved into a computer room that was part of the apartment. While Tiffany was texting with her sister about bags of candy, Emani was laying in the computer room dead. On the 31st, sometime on the 31st, they decided they had to move the body and they were going to take it out and burn it. This defendant urged Eman to do that. Eman, by this time, was starting to say, this is messed up. That's not the words he used. The words he used are obscene. But he said, this is messed up, we need to call the police. The defendant continued to insist, we can't call the police. I can't go to prison. I'm on probation. We have to get rid of the body. So they took her out of the computer room. By that time, rigor mortis had set in. Her body was stiff. Her limbs were stiff. But they bent her, and they broke her, and they managed to get her about this big and duct taped her into this position. And then Eman said that he couldn't put her in a trash can that way, and he covered her with a comforter. And they stuffed it all in a trash bag and carried it down from the apartment and put Emani in the trash can in the truck, in their truck, which was a Trailblazer. That night, early in the morning of November the 1st of 2013, they decided to take the two small children with them and go and burn the body. At first, this defendant was suggesting that they burn the body and get rid of it in Bethesda Park, which was near where they lived. But that didn't work. So they drove around with Emani's body in a trash can in the back of a Trailblazer. And eventually they went up Satellite Boulevard, and Eman noticed a place that he could pull off the road. They both took the trash can out of the truck. We'll prove that to you by the fingerprints of this defendant on the trash can. They poured charcoal briquettes into the bottom of the trash bag. They doused her with lighter fluid, and they set her on fire, and both of them stood there and watched her burn. Eman realized she wasn't going to burn. She wasn't going to burn down to ash. So the fire was put out, and the body was loaded back into the truck. And this defendant, her two children, and Eman drove back to the apartment. The next day, Eman drove the truck to work with the body in the back of the truck. He worked a regular shift, but when he came home, he couldn't take it anymore. He called one of his friends who urged him to call the police. He thought about it. He went to work his second job. But when he got home, he couldn't take it anymore. He told this defendant, "I'm calling the police. I can't do this. This is screwed up." And what did this defendant do? She took her two children, she jumped in the Trailblazer, and she split. And that's how the police got that 3 o'clock in the morning call on November the 2nd. Because Eman, who was hysterical and distraught, thought he wanted to kill himself. And he called the police. The defendant is gone. Now, eventually, she turned herself in to a Roswell police officer and made some statements to that officer, which you'll hear. But that's how this case came to this courtroom. And we intend to prove everything I've told you. And like I said, earlier today, you swore an oath to reach a verdict that speaks the truth. The truth in this case is this defendant, based on the medical evidence and the evidence that we're going to put together, intentionally starved this child to death. Not by accident, not because she wouldn't eat. She refused, as she got sicker and sicker, to give her medical treatment. And then tried to dispose of the body so that they could tell the story of her runaway. And that's malice. And the verdict that speaks the truth in this case is that this defendant is guilty of all these charges. And I believe you'll return it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Moss, your opening statement when you're ready, ma'am.